Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Jure Ayoub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. Or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. So this is a conversation with Reem Sarah Alouane. She is a French legal academic, commentator and PhD candidate in law, researching religious freedom, human rights and civil liberties in France, Europe and North America. We spoke primarily about the recent piece that she wrote entitled A Spectre in France's Public Debate, Islamo-Leftism, for Reset Dialogues. So the topics that we discussed are first is what the hell is Islamo-Leftism in the first place, how these fringe conspiracy theories are being mainstreamed in France, the curious role of anti-American sentiments in propagating these phenomena in France, understanding the specificity of French laicité or secularism. We spoke about how the youth generally are more comfortable with multi-culturalism, which is provoking a conservative backlash. We discussed the slippery slope of what is being normalized more broadly, including the security laws being passed. We even explored the links between antisemitism and Islamophobia, in terms of political rhetoric especially, as well as the legacy of colonial thinking and the personal cost of rising authoritarianism in France. So that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and take care, folks.
My name is Reem Sarah Alouane. I am a French legal academic and a PhD candidate at the University Toulouse Capital. My research mainly focuses on constitutional law, comparative law especially, and civil liberties, religious freedom, and human rights.
The title of your piece, the one we'll be focusing on in this chat, is called A Spectre in France's Public Debate, Islamo-Leftism. And you published this on Reset Dialogues. So just for some background, can you tell us a bit about the piece? Why was it important to write? And for anyone who is not in France, what the hell is Islamo-Leftism in the first place? Just kind of some background.
So you probably know, everybody knows we are in the middle of a pandemic. France, like the situation in France is quite disturbing and worrying. And the only thing that our Minister of Higher Education and Innovation, Frédéric Vidal, found to say before, in an interview, was that she is going to ask for an inquiry on the spread of Islam-Leftism at universities. Honestly, at first, I thought it was a joke. I thought it literally was logographie, which is the French equivalent of the Onion. And then I realized it was not a joke. Was I surprised? No, because it's not something new. But why did I write that piece? Because I am a young scholar. I am doing my PhD on a topic that is very touchy, very tough, very complicated, very heavy. In law, don't add, the whole difficulty. And I couldn't stay silent because those kind of baseless accusations, those conspiracy theories really, reminded me of a very dark time in our history, and especially the 30s. And for those who know a bit of the history of Europe, I think you all know what I'm talking about. And also the accusation at that time of the so-called Judeo-Masonic lobby and all the attacks that eventually ended up with the cleansing of universities and academics under the Vichy regime in the 40s. It's not good news, and I felt that I needed to tell people what's going on and how dangerous this kind of narrative is in how it is the continuity of an ongoing practice from the authorities to target and attempt to limit civil liberties.
The idea of Islamo-Leftism should have rung some bells as well. Judeo-Masonic thing we know as well, but even Judeo-Bolshevism and Jewish Bolshevism, those were things that were also spread in the 30s. And sort of parallel to what we saw under Trump as well, with a kind of a normalization of these kinds of anti-Semitic rhetoric in the US. It started off as fringe ideas, fringe conspiracy theories, and these things through the internet, through various machineries that these days I think many people are familiar with. We're no longer talking, in the context of France here, we're no longer talking about fringe ideas anymore, are we?
Well, unfortunately, these are fringe ideas that are being mainstreamed. So all of these conspiracy theories that literally nobody knows about are now becoming the new normal, because we have certain type of media as well that are spreading them. Like France has an equivalent of Fox News now. It's called CNews. And you were asking me what the hell is Islamo-Leftism, and I want to respond. That's a very good question. Like I mentioned in my piece, this, I don't even want to call it a concept, because it's not a concept. It is like some weird ideology, and this idea was first coined by the French philosopher Pierre-André Taguieff, to basically, essentially, and I don't want to give him too much airtime, to talk about, to call out, to designate the alliances between the far left, and especially the Marxists and Islamists in the UK and in France. And so Islamo-Leftism was used by neocons in France to basically target and go after progressive movements, and trying to discredit activists, who are working on issues related to discrimination, race, intersectionality, gender, women's rights, etc., etc. And basically, the idea is the more you are working on this issue, the most likely you are going to be accused to side with terrorists, and especially at the moment, Islamists and Islamist terrorists. And these attacks on French academia and French universities is also driven by a very strong anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Muslim hatred. So it's a combo of both. And add up to that, since those accusations, and actually the Minister of National Education this time, Jean-Michel Blanquer, declared like it comes from American campuses. So there is also a strong anti-USA sentiment, anti-Americanism sentiment that is added on top of that. And basically implying that anything that comes from America, which is a multicultural country who works on this issue, is a threat to France. Again, it's all conspiracy theory. It's all, divide and conquer. And unfortunately, again, it is not a new phenomenon. It didn't start, with Frédéric Vidal or Jean-Michel Blanquer, accusations. Even back after the first wave of terrorist attacks in the aftermath of Charlie Hebdo, especially, and I mentioned that in my piece too, Manuel Valls, our former prime minister, who is a socialist, right? Basically accused sociologists who try to understand the phenomenon of radicalization, because you need to understand the phenomenon to be able to counter it, to find solutions. Saying something in I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the quote in front of me, but trying to understand is already trying to excuse, which is a very harsh thing to do. And it kept going. So every time an anti-racism group or even academics working on this issue raise those issues, they are accused of siding with terrorism and their name are trash. And finally, add on top of that, within academia, you do have a fringe of academics who are fighting these kind of movements. And the idea is really that all of this group of people want to erase a huge chunk of field of studies, of areas of studies, of research that are related to humanities and social sciences. So that's a bit, of course, I mean, there's so much to say, but just to give you an idea, I hope it makes sense to you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, even the French Minister of Education, I have the tweet that you had posted in October. He had declared not just American university, but he specifically cited intersectionality as responsible for the rise of Islamism and the fragmentation of French society, which is extraordinary to me. Okay, so let's ground listeners who I can sort of get statistics from where most people listen. There's quite a few from France, so there might be already some people already know what we're talking about, but there's quite a bit from the US, from the UK, from the rest of Europe and the Middle East as well. So if we can sort of just provide some historical background to the specific French context of laicité, which is different from secularism. As someone who went to a laic school in Lebanon, I know this very well. And here I quote a section from your essay, quoting. France's constitution is grounded on republican theories which emerged during the century of Enlightenment and crystallized during the French Revolution of 1789. Republicanism stresses a universalist French identity that supersedes individual, cultural, social, or religious belonging, as opposed to an American-style multiculturalism that seeks public respect of cultural diversity. It is the growing popularity of the latter among French citizens that has brought this issue to a head, end quote. When I was reading this, I thought of that segment of Trevor Noah's show that he was, it was after the World Cup, and he had made a joke that, it was also Africa's win when France won. And the minister of something in France reacted, the ambassador to the US, probably the French ambassador, reacted very negatively on Twitter and everything, saying like, unlike in America, where he specifically attacked the hyphenated identities like African American, etc., etc. In France, we don't distinguish between blah blah blah, etc., etc. And people can just find this. He reacted in a certain way, Trevor Noah in a funny way, etc., etc. Okay. So, but there are two things in the paragraph itself. One, the specific form of republicanism, which is different from American republicanism, Irish republicanism. It's a specific French thing. So we can just say laicité to distinguish between the two. So that's one thing, if that's okay. And the second thing, which I can just ask a bit later again, on the growing popularity of multiculturalism in France, especially among the younger generation, like that specific phenomenon, and why is it such a threat to the people who oppose it? Let's put it that way.
So I hope I won't bore your audience too much. And there is a lot of things to say, but I need to give you some historical background. Like I cannot just answer the question like that without giving you some elements of knowledge. So you can just put into context everything. So yeah, France is a constitutional republic, right? Currently governed by the Constitution of 1958. So we are under the Fifth Republic. And it is grounded on Republican theories, which emerged during the Enlightenment, and which was really put into place, crystallized during the revolution. Of course, it's a process. It didn't start with the revolution, but the revolution was like a bit of a starting point, right? And, although France is a country of immigrants, because of our past, we are a country colonized many other countries, and we are still, and we will talk about it a bit later, I guess. Still didn't make peace with that, really. It is a country of Frenchmen. And despite its cultural diversity, France is one of the most multi-ethnic, multi-diverse, multicultural country in Western Europe. Yet it is a monocultural society, and I will explain that. The notion of assimilation is ideologically fundamental to French republicanism that coincides, if you want, with the notions of universalism, pluralism, and secularism. And of course, I will focus especially on universalism and secularism, which we call in French laicité, because for me, laicité is a form of secularism. And I will explain a little bit why I think it's that way. And assimilation is, if you want, the sine qua non condition to citizenship. So meaning that, for example, immigrants who want to become French should adopt the French culture, even though this notion of cultures or even values are nowhere to be defined, and reject others' values. And republicanism in France is traditionally defined in its universalist nature, and meaning that in France, like the French identity, if you want, transcends particularism, transcends any cultural, any social, any religious belonging in order to achieve individual autonomy. That's a bit the idea, as opposed to multi-culturalism, which can be found especially in the Anglo-American world, which traditionally seeks the official, sometimes even legal recognition of cultural diversity. And republicanism, presupposes that the state is free from any influence from, for example, the church and religion. And that's when I'm going to talk about the laicité. Laicité is a very interesting concept. It found its roots in the revolution, actually. We because of the history, the very chaotic history we have with the Roman Catholic Church, especially, France is suspicious towards religion in general. France hates religion, really. And between you and I and everybody who is listening, one of France's dreams is really to control religion, right? I mean, let's be honest about it. But fast forward to 1882. So we are at the beginning of, the end, 1882, so 19th century. It was at school that this notion was implemented first, because school is considered in France the place where you are going to make the French citizen. And to be able to do that, you need to remove the Catholic Church influence from education. So under Jules Ferry, who at that time was Minister of Instruction, meaning education, he passed a series of laws on public education. And for example, he replaced religious moral, which at that time was a thing, like teaching religious moral to kids, with civic moral. So it was, again, the idea was not to remove religion, because, religion is part of society too, but for the French, the only way for you to be able to be a citizen is to be free from religion too. And then, of course, fast forward to 1905, we adopted the law on separation of churches and state, which is basically the foundation of the management of state and religion in this country. Fun fact, laicité does not appear in the law at all. It's until 1946 that the Constitution of 1946 mentioned laicité. But in the law, actually, it's nowhere to be found. This law is actually quite simple, and it's a law of appeasement, because you had two schools that fought each other during the debates that preceded happened before the adoption of the law. Those who really wanted to get rid of religion. No more religion, the public square has to be neutral, nothing. And the vision of laicité, which won over actually in the law, which was not anti-religion at all, but it was anti-clerical. So it's more the power of the church in terms of influence within the political structure, the government structure. And the idea was simple: to be able to protect freedom of religion, but also freedom of conscience. So the right to believe, to not believe, to change religion, to maybe one day have a religion or not. You need to impose the neutrality of the state, meaning that the state does not recognize or have a favorite religion, and they must remain neutral. So civil servants are neutral. Religious neutrality is imposed upon the state, not upon private individuals who are free to exercise their right to freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. And that was the idea. The idea really was not to prevent the visibility of religion from happening. I'm not saying that it was all unicorn, glitter, and rainbows, because there was anti-religion sentiment, of course, especially against the Catholic. And for those who knows about the French history with religion, we have a very dark history. Like, we are not good with that. But the idea really was to appease everybody. And that's pretty much it. Now, the problem we have today, and pardon, like I'm trying to really give you the big lines. The problem we have today is, so the law of 1905, in my opinion, is very liberal. If, in other words, if I want to compare with the United States, for example, in the US, they have a wall of separation between religion and the state, especially, so it was theorized by Roger Williams, the founder of the state of Rhode Island, the idea that nobody interfere with each other. And it was made in a way that religion, believers, are protected against the potential abuses from the state. And in a way, I think America is a laic country, but their views is that you can be as religious or a-religious or atheist as you are protected because as an individual, you have a right to think what you want. In France, it's the other way around. We want to protect the state from the abuses of religion. So in France, religious freedom has limits. It's public order, right? So it's very interesting to see that. So it was, for the French, it was a liberal law, really. Now, problem is, today, this very liberal vision has been transformed into a tool to target religious minorities, and especially Muslims and Islam. And it has been like 13 years, but again, you need to take into account our colonial past and the way we treated the Muslims in our colonies. And I'm especially thinking of Algeria, but not only. And now laicité has been transformed into some sort of monsters that really have nothing to do with the law of 1905. Now we have this restricted view of laicité, which implies erasing any view of religion. And I think it goes against the spirit of 1905, of the law of 1905. And I think it's dangerous. I think we went from a liberal interpretation to an illiberal one, but one of the problems, again, with laicité is that if its historical definition is agreed upon, like nobody really disagree with the history, there is no legal definition of laicité. Meaning that, and I think it was done on purpose by the lawmakers at that time, meaning that when you don't have a definition, it's open. And you can have a very liberal definition of laicité depending on, time, political time, like the situation, the context, and a very restrictive one. And I think that's the main issue today. Sorry if I was too long.
No, this was perfect. Thanks a lot for that. The second part of the question, which I said I'll bring up again, is especially among the youth, I guess there's a bigger ease, I think it's fair to say, with the notion of a multiculturalism, with the notion that, you can be more than one thing at a time. And this is definitely making a lot of people, especially people in power and on the right, but not just on the right, which is part of the problem, fairly uncomfortable. So can you talk a bit about that phenomenon as well?
Yes, like I said, anything that comes from the Anglo-American world is seen as a threat here, which is very sad. And I think it speaks volume more about the people in power and that those who actually feel comfortable enough in their identity to promote it in a way that is faithful to the French tradition, right? Like I mentioned, the Republican tradition still holds very strong within French society. And social policies in France emphasizes really in this notion of assimilation, to which I would ask, assimilation to what? To what? I mean, most of the time we talk about mainland France, and I will make the connection with multiculturalism afterwards. We tend to forget that we have overseas territories that are French. I mean, it's France, right? I don't know, Guyana, Guadeloupe, New Caledonia, Mayotte, La Réunion, etc., etc., Wallis et Futuna, French Polynesia. Their culture is very different from ours, and it's okay. That's what makes France so vibrant and dynamic and awesome. So assimilating to what exactly? What kind of values are we talking about? And I think we all know the answer. The answer is that those in power want to remain the one in power and dominate other groups that are more vulnerable, saying the minorities, as in, people of immigrant background, especially. And I think that one of the reasons, I'm not saying it explains everything, but I think it's a really good and important start. We are a country in denial. We still to refuse to see our past, to make peace with our past, to repair our past, to move forward to a better future, right? Colonialism in France, I mean, of course, historians, it's not a taboo for historians, activists, researchers, because everybody studied it. But for those in power, it's still a sore topic. Colonialism is in the past, and we still talk about the positive effects of colonialism. Can you imagine that? What kind of positive? I mean, it's wild. And today you have voices from people, especially of immigrant background, who are like, hello, we need to do something about it. And I think the main issue with the political establishment is that they still do not accept the fact that the second, third generation of children are French and consider themselves as French. Because for years, and it's still going on now, we still don't consider this population as part of the fabric of this country, even though these people and the immigrants who came in this country after decolonization built this country, right? It's racism. I mean, let's put words on the phenomenon. We still have this view, oh, there is no racism. We're not America. We don't see color. We are a colorblind nation. We are a universalist country. You know what? In theory, I would agree. Yes, it's great that we are universal. We don't see you as a minority. We see you as a human being that deserves protection because of his human being condition. But come on, in practice, discrimination are rising. You have more chance to get a job if you're white and your name is Jean-Claude than if you're Black or of North African background and name is Mohammed. And I'm not the one just saying that. There are reports about it. We have an ombudsman, the Défenseur des droits, so the defender of rights, who constantly write reports about that. Racial profiling, we can talk for, it's another topic for another time, but we do have issues with racial profiling, economic disparities, no social mobility. And we are, I think, using universalism as a way to remain blind. We cannot be racist, we don't see color. What are you talking about? We are not America. We always come back to we are not America. But we're not talking about America here. We're talking about this country. And I think the problem is today, the structure, the power, its structure are shaken because it's not sustainable. It will fall apart at some point, but it will get worse before it gets better, I think.
The we are not America just makes me a bit giggle sometimes, just because in the UK it's always we are not Europe, and it's just they each have their own, they each have their own we are not. It's always defined in the negative. But I'll definitely come back to a UK-France comparison because it ties to a previous episode I did as well. But as it happens, just a few days before we were recording this, and we're recording this on April the 9th, 2021, just for the record, it was announced that l'Observatoire de la laicité, the Observatory of Laicité, Observatory of Secularism, would be shut down. And it's a big deal. It hasn't gotten the coverage it should be getting outside of France, as far as I know. But it goes back to what you were talking about the importance of different interpretations and how this is actually threatening some people in power. So to that end, can you explain the role of the observatory and the significance of this move by the Minister Delegate of Citizenship? And I will note, just before I let you answer, that Jean-Louis Bianco, the president of the observatory, he asked, why do they want to break a tool that works? And then he answered, we bothered them because we are independent. And so just with that, would you mind just explaining what happened there and who they are and why it's important?
So just to give even a bit more precision regarding the timeline. So technically, so the term of the president and the rapporteur of the Observatory of Laicité ended on April 2nd, but the mission of the observatory ends in 2022, so next year. But so I think it's a period of transition, basically. So just to give you some quick background, the Observatory of Laicité is basically the guardian of laicité. It's a consultancy agency. It's an autorité administrative indépendante. It's a consultative commission designed to help the government to enforce and promote laicité. It is, sorry to get into the legal details, but it is attached to the prime minister. However, they are quite they are very autonomous and actually independent, to use the words of Jean-Louis Bianco. They are composed of 23 members, including a member of parliaments from across the political spectrum. And I think that's what it makes it so appealing and so strong, is that it's really bring together many many views from different political ideologies and ideas. And they also have experts on the topic and highly qualified civil servants that also work for them. So why are we dismantling, why it was announced by Marlène Schiappa that the observatory will be dismantled? Because they did a job. And they explained the law of laicité. They did a fantastic field work. So they advise the government, but they also give training in public schools as well as private organizations to basically explain the law without any form of partisanship. That's the law, that's the rules, that's how it works. And for that, basically they refuse to fall into the trap of going after Muslims for the sake of going after Muslims. So what happened is, it was heavily criticized for not, for example, going after Muslim women wearing a headscarf, because they would explain you in what case the headscarf is prohibited and in what case it's perfectly fine for them to do that. I give you just an example because it was one of the most prominent examples. And we have another issue in France, is that we have some groups of what they call the fundamentalist secularists, so les laïcards. From the left, again, it's a fringe, very loud fringe of the left that the intellectual left, who basically are really anti-religion and very anti-Muslim as well. And they have very questionable tactics to go after anyone who dare to defend a liberal vision of laicité. And unfortunately, Jean-Louis Bianco and Nicolas Cadenne, so the president and the rapporteur, were really victims of campaigns of harassment, of pressure. And these groups managed to influence the state, I think. So I think that's what happened here, is that the government is more into implementing a very restrictive vision of laicité that literally have nothing to do with 1905. And as a proof of that, yesterday there was an article, so we are the 9th, so on the 8th, there was an article in Le Monde, an interview of Jean-Michel Blanquer, so the Minister of National Education, who literally admitted that he succeeded in implementing his restrictive view of laicité. I have written extensively about it. That's what I call the weaponization of laicité. The same way some would use religion for their political agenda, and there are a lot of countries who are doing that. In France, we are using laicité to fulfill ours, to make sure that laicité is not about freedom, but is about restriction and targeting certain groups we deem incapable of integrating, the Muslims. And unfortunately, this comes at a time when I think we need the observatory more than ever, because they bring sanity to this madness. They are the only ones who actually had the line and just explain the law. Apparently, so we don't have any further details, but they are going to replace it with another institution that might be like a sort of administration of laïcité, so pour administrer la laïcité. And I'm afraid, I hope to be wrong on this one. So what I'm saying is not what's going to happen, it's what I fear will happen, just so we're clear. I fear that we are going to replace the observatory with an institution that will be, which goal will be to be the police of laïcité. And I hope to be wrong on this one, because it's not good news. It's really no good news at all.
I mean, I have the same fear. And I mean, just to add to what you were saying about Blanquer, he even said that it's a challenge for civilization. And for me, as soon as you use the C word, civilization, that's when a lot of the red flags, start popping up in my mind. But the day after that announcement, so like on April 6th, to keep track of time, this is also, you tweeted about this. A right-wing senator said, and I quote, "We need to refuse prayers in the hallways of universities," end quote, implying Muslim prayers. Putting aside that we're in the middle of a pandemic and there aren't that many classes, you and many others, I just saw random people responding in the same way, that saying, well, I've been in the university for 5 years and I've never seen that happening. And, many people are basically saying the same thing. But of course, to me, again, from where I'm standing, from like an anti-authoritarian and just something that I try and keep track of in different places, usually when such comments become more and more open and more normalized, we would say, it becomes a slippery slope into then what ends up becoming, because they kind of shift the center of what is becoming normalized. I'm repeating myself, but like the center of what's becoming normal to talk about. And in this case, it's becoming more and more right-wing, we might say, even with the complicity of many on the left, as you said. And I'll get more into that for sure. I have a lot to say on this. So yeah, my question, I guess, is maybe a repetition, I'm not sure, just asking you a reflection on the slippery slope of, maybe even in legal terms, you may have more insight definitely than I do, in where this can lead in terms of what gets normalized, if that makes sense.
Same, actually, when I listened to this MP who wanted to pass an amendment on, declaring like what you just, we need to stop praying. I mean, I have been at university for way too long. I thought it was also le Gorafi. Like, I'm like, it's a joke. Come on. Like, I have never seen that in my life. We have like 99 problems at university, but praying in the hallway is not one of them. I mean, the worst problem we have, beside that the Wi-Fi never working, is that research is underfunded, our researchers are all leaving, and there is a rise of student poverty. Many of them during the pandemic are mentally struggling. Some try to commit suicide. And the priority of some is to prohibit prayers in the hallway. Honestly, like I'm not even surprised, but problem is, like, we have a saying in French, plus c'est gros, plus ça passe. Meaning, roughly, the bigger the lie is, the most likely people are starting to going to believe it. And by the way, I put Islamo-Leftism in the same category. Nobody heard about Islamo-Leftism. I mean, the people, I mean, those who have been following and, you know, the debates, of course. But as soon as you throw something and, you know, start to play with this notion that this is a threat, we need to be careful, we are going to legislate on it. You play with fears, with people's fears, because people want security. So of course, people will start believing it, right? And is it a slippery slope? I would say it's more than a slippery slope. It's authoritarian methods. And I do not use that word slightly. I don't like to use the A word just for the sake, like fascist or whatever. Like I use that very cautiously. But we are no better than many in terms of strategy, I mean, because of course I will never compare the situation of France with those of the people who actually live and have to go through through authoritarian regimes. But it is the same methods. You know, you target a group of people, whether it's like the Muslims or the you know, women's rights activists, or LGBTQ plus activists, etc. You consider them a threat, and you are going to make things up to be able to pass legislation to justify more restriction of civil liberties. And that's what's currently going on in France. There is not a year in this country without us passing a law restricting civil liberties even more. And that's the issue. You know, we use Muslims today, but after Muslims, they would go after another group of people. And it's not the new kind of phenomenon. Again, go back to history. That's how it starts, right? And again, I don't want to sound alarmist. And I know that today, compared to years ago, we now have legal ways to counter that. But still, it is dangerous. It is extremely dangerous and worrying, because now we don't care about the rule of law anymore. Actually, they would tell that to your face. The rule of law does not allow us to fight terrorism. So yes, we need to bypass it when it can. We are talking about people who are, you know, even working for courts saying that, right? So yes, unfortunately, that's how the vilification process works. You target someone, you make things up, or if it's like a marginal phenomenon, you make it bigger than it is. And instead of opening a debate, for example, and I mean, you don't even need a debate on something that is completely made up, but like, if you need to talk about certain issues, do it in a civil way. Don't do it in the way to vilify people. So yes, we are, I think we crossed a red line. And unfortunately, I think we reached a point of no return here. And the problem is, and I said that in the beginning of our conversation, the more it's normalized, the more it's mainstream, the more some media will actually condemn that without giving a voice to the people affected by these measures, the more we are at risk to see our democracy and its foundation falling apart. And unfortunately, we are in the middle of the process.
And speaking of just some of the, I think this is just one more on the legal side, if that's okay, because I have a lot to rant about, but I'm waiting a bit. Just one more question. There is a direct link between this fear mongering and the state putting forward bills, as you just mentioned, such as, and these are the English title of these bills, the bill is strengthening Republican principles, and the bill on global security, red alarms all over the place on both of these things. As you mentioned both of those in the piece, I should say. I don't know if this is a repetition. If it is, we can just go to the other one. But can you talk a bit more on maybe these specific bills, or if there are other bills that I haven't mentioned, because this will help elucidate the problem, I think, a bit more.
No, it's not a repetition at all, because everything is connected. As you all probably know, France has gone through horrific terrorist attacks. I don't have any words to really qualify. They're horrible, and the latest being, the attacks in Nice against the church, and Samuel Paty, these teachers who was slaughtered for doing his job, really. And the problem we have in France is that the response to terrorist attacks is often an emotional response and not a rational one. And I personally believe that it's in time of crisis like this that we need to protect and reinforce civil liberties even more. And we are doing the opposite. So every terrorist attack is used as an excuse to pass laws that violate our civil liberties. So indeed, the bill strengthening Republican principle, which is currently being discussed before the Senate. I mean, they're going wild at the moment, like the passing amendments, which is, by the way, this bill is not even a counterterrorism bill. In my opinion, it's a bill that literally reshaped the relation between state and religion to control Islam even more. This bill is not like, you probably heard about this amendment prohibiting the wearing of religious signs for people going on school trips to go with kids. It's targeting Muslim women wearing a headscarf who go on school trip to help teachers, someone explain me with a straight face, how is that going to stop terrorism and stop radicalization? Seriously. Anywho, also the bill on global security, and one of the most controversial amendments, the prohibition to take pictures of cops during protests. And actually, there is one forgotten that has not been really discussed because it's a bit, behind the scene, but like the reform on universities. And one particular amendment, which was rewritten ever since, but one of the amendments stated, I think I have the quote somewhere, stated that basically all lectures, academic freedom is exercised having regard to the values of the Republic. It's straight from like the authoritarian playbook. Who decide? Who control? What does that even mean? Knowing that academic freedom is constitutionally protected, right? So this amendment was meant to die immediately, but damage is done. Honestly, it's not the point that it passed or didn't pass at this point. It's here, right? And during the discussion on the big strengthening Republican values, actually many amendments went after universities. And I think that all of these measures are taken to cover our incompetence and failure to actually address terrorism. And you have to understand that in France, France has one of the strongest legal apparatus in matters of countering terrorism. Especially, I don't know if so. After the 2015 terrorist attacks, so Charlie Hebdo, Le Bataclan, etc., we went through 2 years of state of emergency. Spoiler alert: it's not normal. It's not normal. And after the end of state of emergency, we adopted a law So it was the law on interior security and fight against terrorism of 2017, which essentially, listen that, which essentially made many features of state of emergency laws, which are extremely restrictive laws in matter of civil liberties, into permanent law. And yet, we were not able to prevent terrorist attacks from happening. And what are we doing? We are passing more laws to go after civil liberties on the grounds of fighting terrorism and radicalization. And yeah, we often use the argument of terrorism to propose, adopt, work on such types of law. And I think that not only the response will not change a thing, but it will most likely worsen the situation by eroding civil liberties and increasing the stigmatization of Muslims, especially, who keep being perceived as the usual suspect, if I'm making any sense. So unfortunately, like just to conclude a little bit this matter, there are many signs in the political elites and even some in academia. It's a fringe, but it's still strong, right? The elite that wants to keep basic, because even in academia, there is a structure of power. It's a microcosm, who are ready to abandon, to give up on the core value of the rule of law. And fundamental rights, human rights, civil liberties, now more than ever, need to be defended because they are on trial. They are on trial. And like I said, it's in time of crisis that we need the reinforcement, that we need to strengthen civil liberties and human rights.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. On a more like, I don't know, maybe abstract level, I guess. But so I wanted to mention a conversation that I had recently. It's episode 67 for those listening, with Professor Dave Andres. He is, I'm finding it a bit funny, or maybe I shouldn't, but he is sort of he fits a portfolio of what a lot of the people that were complaining about in this chat, the sort of person that they would hate the most. He's English and his specialty is the French Revolution. And he wrote a book called Cultural Dementia, in which he called How the West Lost Its History and Risks Losing Everything Else. That's the subtitle. But in which he explicitly compares France, the UK, and the US. So like taboos all around, basically, on all three sides. And the reason why he focuses on these three, I won't say too much about this because, I mean, the conversation is already very long, the conversation with him, I mean. But one of the things worth pointing out from that conversation is how ironically similar, just to focus on two of the three, the UK and France actually are on many things, even though one is a monarchy and one is a republic, obviously. And I mean, of course, they have their own specificity. It's not the same thing. I don't want to make any blanket statements here. But there is, in the UK, we're seeing stuff like obsession over the Union flag. There's a very good write-up in The Guardian, I'll try and find it and link it, which compares how like in the 90s, everyone was fine with the Spice Girls wearing, you know, the Union flag and shoes and socks, and everyone was just fine with it. And it's actually part of the idea of not taking ourselves too seriously, ourselves in this case being, as in the Brits would say that. This has changed. Now it's actually, there are lots of Tory MPs saying that there should be a flag, the Union Jack, on every school ground in the UK. Forgetting that on the Union Jack, you don't have the flag of Wales, so that was a bit awkward. Of course, in Scotland, it's sensitive for its Scottish-related reasons. But, you know, etc., just on the flag issue. There is the fact that so many cops were sent to protect the statue of Winston Churchill in Trafalgar Square in London from quote-unquote woke militants, and here I'm using terms used by the British tabloids especially. You have Tory MPs telling the BBC to remember that the B stands for British, implying that the BBC is now somehow not British enough, even though it's kind of like the quintessential British institution, and so on and so on. In France, it's La République, always caps lock, it has to majuscule. This at once, in both cases, it's at once apparently strong thing. It's always, in the UK, they would literally say strong and stable. Theresa May would say strong and stable government. That was the main thing, which collapsed like a few weeks later. But it's both strong and stable, but at the same time, it requires constant defending from imagined enemies. And this is where the slippery slope starts happening, because the imagined enemies, they cannot always be imagined. You have to apply that violence on actual bodies. That's how it's always worked. And so, the irony of these two former empires, one a monarchy, one a republic, having so much in common, I'm sure lots of people will see the irony in that, especially the whole, like, we are not British, and on the other side, we are not French, etc., etc. Okay, I'll transition to, I just wanted to say that as a kind of a comment. I will transition to something that will maybe at first appear off topic, but I think it's actually relevant. So I have an episode with Daniel Randall. I think it's going to be the one just after this episode, but I forgot the timeline. And he's a British Jewish leftist activist, organizer, etc. And he's currently writing a book on the specific phenomenon of left-wing anti-Semitism in the UK specifically. Just as a disclaimer, I'm reading the book and I'm offering comments. One thing that I've come to notice, and this is where my background as Lebanese, Palestinian, etc. comes into play, issues related to Israel-Palestine in France, as in the UK, less so in America, but especially in the UK, I would say, are very rarely about Israelis or Palestinians. It's actually rather about these two specific countries' own histories and legacies. In the UK, of course, the Balfour Declaration, blah, blah, blah. It's a different episode. But one thing that for me, what this shows is just it's another consequence of many consequences of the narcissism of post-imperial countries, largely in denial of that imperial past, because there's no point of seeing what's actually happening there. It's all about our relationship, our imagined relationship to that land. Our here in the case of France, UK, etc. Brexit is a more obvious example, I think. In my conversation with Dave Anders, I mentioned how there was one Tory MP that during the Olympics, she said that the British Empire was winning the gold medal, and she had just put a map, and you had the Commonwealths like India and Australia, and they were all part of the British Empire. So it was pretty explicit. And in France, it's also like in the UK, it's mostly about denying colonialism and its legacies, but also denying, and this is where the anti-Semitism comes into play, the role of France in the Holocaust. And this is something that many people don't really understand, so I just wanted to bring it up. And I'll mention that example. When it comes to France, the relationship to the past is one which alternates between, from my standpoint, occasional recognition, usually surface level. Sometimes there's some recognition. Macron, while campaigning, he sort of recognized some horrors, but surface level. And it alternates between that and obsessive repetition. So in the fact that Macron and Chirac, to their credit, I don't want to credit them too much, but to their credit on that specific thing, to be fair, the fact that they even mentioned France's Nazi past was enough to provoke a huge backlash from both the right, which is expected, but also from the left. And this is where, for me, the anti-authoritarianism priorities come into play. Chirac recognized that there were crimes happening. Macron more specifically said that, that there is official French culpability in the Holocaust because of the role of the French, and obviously the Vichy regime. Both Mélenchon on the left and Le Pen on the right, far right, agree on the fact that this was not France that committed these things, because for them, France, i.e. the Republic, equals the Republic, and the Republic was in exile in London with de Gaulle. I'm going to put aside the irony of France being in London with Brexit and everything, but let's put that aside. With that in mind, what they are saying is that France was not France. And so it's very easy, if you start with that, we're saying, well, it wasn't us, like, that wasn't us, even though it was us. It was France. It was part of the French. And of course, this doesn't deny the French resistance. On the contrary, they were resisting an internal enemy in addition to the external enemy, the Nazi occupation. But this denies the fact that it was the French police and the French gendarmes that decided to arrest and deport 13,152 Jews in France. It's called the Rafle du Veldiv roundup in English. So this is kind of some of the background. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is that there is increasing talk in some anti-authoritarian circles, and I just want to make it a bit more well-known. I think it's not that as mainstream as I would hope it would be, that the general hostility towards or fear of the past goes even beyond Islamophobia. And it just takes different manifestation. Islamophobia in both the UK and especially in France, sometimes even more than the UK, to be honest, or at least more blatantly, let's put it that way. The UK has a lot of Islamophobia, don't get me wrong, is the sort of the first point. It's what they actually use to attack the past or to deny the past, because in this case, not to be too metaphorical about it, but it's also about denying the colonial past. And so for me, when I hear that, it serves almost or when I hear the sort of light, quote unquote, Holocaust denialism of the variety of Mélenchon and Le Pen, because that's what it is. I have to be blatant about it. Is a sort of a canary in a coal mine situation. They all, like, as it's, to paraphrase an activist called Vicky Osterweil, it's a dual scapegoat of like the Jew within and the Muslim without. Like it's both, like, there's an enemy from within, but there's also an enemy coming from without, and you always have to fight off these enemies, and which one takes the priority actually has to do with today's politics. So I'm rambling a bit, sorry. But so my question to you, to go back to you, so I don't just stop on my own, and it's a bit more abstract, but in the UK, as I said, I would argue that both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are common. They take different forms. They don't affect political culture in the same way in the immediate terms. Islamophobia has more political capital. It's just easier for various reasons. In France as well, it is easier for various reasons. Although in France, as the example of the Veldiv shows, anti-Semitism can exist not even below the surface. But they don't call it that, so it doesn't get called that, and they have the power to name what they want to name. So my question to you, and I hope all of this made sense, but my question to you is: do you see links between these two, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? Maybe in terms of the law, I'm not too sure about that, but in terms of political rhetoric, we mentioned the comparisons to the 30s. I know this gets thrown a lot, and I don't want to take it further than where we should in some ways. But there is a real and objective reason as to why some of these alarm bells should ring, essentially. So this question to you, sorry, specifically about the inability or unwillingness in France to confront this past. Do you see these parallels, maybe not with America because it's kind of a different situation, but at least with the UK? Because for me, it's as clear as day, in the way where I stand anyway.
Actually, I just hope to make justice to your brilliant comments and observations. So I hope I will. No, I do agree with you. Just a couple of thoughts. So sorry if it's not completely connected. I would just throw that away. First of all, anti-Semitism is still going very strong in France. It's horrific. It's disgusting, and it's very concerning to see that so much hatred, and you said it from across the political spectrum, from the far right to the far left, is still going on against our Jewish communities who do not feel safe in France in 2021. Even worse, we are actually using the Jews today as a way to go after Muslims. So, for example, and basically the Jewish communities are being used as pawn, if you want to, divide and conquer. It's really what it is. And which is a very colonial kind of mindset, I think. Meaning, for example, I just give you this example because it comes, it actually comes very often in our current debates. So when we talk about the hijab or anything that is like related to Muslims and flavored with strong anti-Muslim sentiment, to justify the anti-Muslim hatred, some would argue, politicians, but also pundits, some intellectuals, Islam cannot fit in Europe, Islam cannot fit in France because your values violate the quote unquote the Judeo-Christian values, doesn't fit into, I quote, the Judeo-Christian civilization. To which I always respond, the Judeo part of Judeo-Christian values, before or after the Holocaust? Before or after the Dreyfus affair? We are the country of the Dreyfus affair. Like, for those who are not familiar, I mean, I cannot stop talking about this, but it's the case where a French soldier was accused of treason, even though actually he didn't do it. It was a coup, and he was dismissed from the army. All of his honors were removed. And it was not after years that we discovered the plot. And the whole case was fed with anti-Semitism. And you probably all know J'accuse, right? And so it's all, and you had the pro and the anti-Dreyfusards. So France was divided in two. And it's still the case today somehow. I mean, of course, it's not the same situation and so on, but it's still here. We're still like, and I think maybe that's the similarity with Muslim. We still perceive Jews as others, as people who are not part of this country. And I think it's horrific. I think it's horrible. All conspiracy theories are always based on, Judaism and Jews, and it's COVID. It's a conspiracy from the Jews. Oh my God, stop it. I mean, it's so ridiculous and dangerous. And unfortunately, this divide and conquer mentality works in some circle. Oh, we are going to protect the Jews, but not the Muslims, even though actually both categories deserve, and it's not the mistake of the Jews, it's really the same elite, like it's white supremacy, I'm going to use the word. It's another form of white supremacy. And to keep going on colonialism and the monarchy vs. the republic, I always joke, but actually I have to joke, and I know I receive hatred after saying that, but that's fine, I'm used to it. France is a republic that I think is still governed like the ancient regime. I mean, to be honest, we are still governed like under a monarchy, except that today it's not a king, it's like a president that gets all powers, and the executive is reinforced, and all the regions, the départements are basically fiefs, like in the Middle Age. If you listen to, the election comments, it's like, le fiefs of the land of XYZ politician. I'm like, hey, dude, it's a republic. It's not like, you're not a lord, and we are like the peasants. When I use that word, it's like the, third estate, right? So it's very interesting. And to connect everything to colonialism, and I think I briefly mentioned this a bit earlier, like in our conversation, France is still governed by its colonial mindset. It still doesn't get rid of it because that's how it works. And the problem is, the more they are called out on that, they know it's not sustainable. I think that's what I mentioned previously. I will give credit to Chirac and Macron on those issues. So indeed, with Chirac, for the first time, if you take the war of Algeria, the reason why I take Algeria, I don't want to dismiss other countries. It's absolutely not what I'm doing. Morocco suffered, Tunisia suffered, Mauritania, Senegal, like sub-Saharan Africa, don't get me wrong. But the thing with Algeria is that at that time, it was not just a protectorate, it was a French département, as in a French province. So, basically the day of the independence when France lost Algeria, let's say it's like if the US lost Texas or California. Just to give you like an idea for the picture, right? And essentially, Chirac, for the first time, talk about a war of Algeria. Until then, we talk about the events. It was just a public order disturbance. Fun fact for our listeners, state of emergency laws were born under the war of Algeria, the quote unquote public order disturbance. No, it was not a public order disturbance. It's people who were, who didn't have any rights, who were controlled, colonized, whose worst crimes were committed against them, who basically wanted to be free. They were fighting for their freedoms because they were not treated as human, as equal with their other French citizens. They were in quote, les indigènes, the indigenous. They didn't have the same rights because they were Muslims, because Muslims were deemed incapable of integrating. Islam was not a religion that was able to fit into into that culture. A decree gave rights to the Jews, so divide and conquer. But the Jews were treated in a less better way than the Christians. And France did that in a lot of countries where, and of course, I'm not being nuanced here, like there is so much to say, but I won't get into the details. And just to come back to the topic, what happened is at the end of the independence, it was a soul lost. And Macron, during his presidential campaign, for the first time, called colonialism for what it is, a crime against humanity. Rapes were committed, murder were committed. The first time we used gas chamber were against the Algerian Muslims by the General Bugeaud, right? In the 18th, when the French started to arrive in Algeria to colonize it, where we put a bunch of Algerian Muslims and Algerian people, women and men, who were fighting the colonizer. We put them into a cave and they started a fire to burn them. A gas chamber was used in Algeria at that time. And the General Bugeaud has a whole street in Paris after his name. Some consider him a national hero. I find it problematic personally as someone who is of Algerian background, and who is fully French, born and raised here. I don't have an issue of identity or whatever, but it is problematic. Like, how can you celebrate a person who is literally a murderer, right? And so Macron declared that, so colonization was a crime against humanity. He received so much hatred from the right and also from some in the left. No, it was like the golden age of France. Les effets positifs de la colonisation, the positive effects of colonization. What the heck is wrong with you guys? We still believe that actually colonization, it was a mission civilisatrice. We are going to civilize, quote unquote, the savages. That was the rhetoric, by the way, at that time, right? And some are still not over it. Even though, again, historians have done an incredible work, activists. But unfortunately, Macron also made some controversial comments on colonization. So it's not all like perfect. And recently, he ordered a report to famous historian Benjamin Stora, who gave this report. I think it was, it was a good thing, but I didn't expect much. But, it was one step forward, 10 steps backwards. Essentially, the reports, it was all about like trying to reconnect both countries, add status of Algerian heroes, yada, yada, but out of the question to apologize. And I'm like, you know what? I don't care about stages of Emir Abdelkader. If you don't apologize, because for me, not apologizing means two things. A, that you don't think that what you've done before was wrong. And second, the apology, I think, of course, to the Algerian people, but Algerians know what happened, right? But for the French, France need to apologize at least for itself to not repeat the same mistake in the future. Not necessarily talking about colonization, but violation of human rights, how we treat minorities, etc., etc. And I'm like, no apology, then what? Okay, you're going to add status, you're going to open a museum. I mean, I'm not against that, don't get me wrong, and I think that also colonization has been used by both Algeria and France for their own political agenda. So in France to basically do what we talk about, and in Algeria, which is an authoritarian regime, right, a military one, who uses colonization to control its population and to justify certain action, and nobody buys it, seriously, especially the youngest generation, like nobody buys it. And I think everybody wants to move forward, right? And the issue in this country is that when you call that out, and that's why post-colonial studies bother, because we study things that are very tough, but that are necessary. Nobody is asking to organize a coup against the French Republic. No, it's like, okay, this happened. We need to find a solution to repair what we have done to make our future better as French citizens. And that's something that the French establishment still refused to do. And to connect everything with anti-Semitism, unfortunately, I mean, it still reminds me of the worst time in the 18th, 19th century when the Jews, and again, I'm not comparing situation, like each situation is very unique and specific. We consider the Jews are incapable of being French citizens because they were Jewish. And they were deemed incapable of being part of France because their culture, their religion was not compatible with, I mean, according to, of course, the elite at the time, was not compatible with, the French values, the French culture. So I think my point is, in each, across history, throughout history, those who want to keep power and dominate always use a scapegoat to be able to advance their agenda and keep that power, and use a good old divide and conquer. And I think we need to go beyond that, because it is dangerous for democracy. It is dangerous for the rule of law as well. Where do we stop? So yes, anti-Semitism must be fought without any, definitely, and any form of racism. And the thing is, today, we still refuse to recognize anti-Muslim hatred for what it is, because it is acceptable to go after a religion that, or a group of people that we deem incapable of integrating. And that's the same rhetoric we used during colonization. So I don't know if I completely answered your question, but I just threw some thoughts, and I hope I gave justice to your brilliant analysis.
Thank you. No, you did. And I was, while you were speaking, I opened some tabs just to remember. And so a number of things. I will definitely get into this more with Daniel, the British activist I mentioned before. But the term Judeo-Christian, A, is a recent invention. It's not a historical one. And B, as you said, it conveniently overlooks the fact that the Judeo bit has actually been rejected by the Christian bit for pretty much 90% of Europe's history. And they're pretty good articles, including by, I should say, again, quote unquote, to be fair, but by people who are conservative and who are Jewish, for example, saying why they're uncomfortable with the term Judeo-Christian due to that history. But another thing is that the whole, the Jew within, the Muslim without, we also saw this. I have a previous episode, episode 69 for those listening, with Aida Hozic from Bosnia. It will be out by the time our episode is out. And one thing that's very obvious about the Muslim other, and of course we know what happened in Srebrenica and in Sarajevo and in Bosnia in general, with that story, the genocide. The comparisons are never good. That's one thing I want. You said like you don't want to compare it to and comparing is never good in itself because it's imperfect. But it's useful in as much as it allows us to just see some of these parallels. And the whole "this is not as bad as the 30s" was used. I mean, the French don't want to be compared to the Americans, but was used in America quite a lot. And we saw Trump, for example, saying that he will protect the Jews against the Muslims, even as his supporters were chanting stuff like "Jews will not replace us," and in Charlottesville, and the attack on the synagogue, the massacre at the synagogue, as we know. These things can be used by, divide and conquer is indeed a very old strategy, but it doesn't get translated very well, even by people who are supposed to be doing it. It's a messy business. They're not as smart as they would like to believe. And that's not really the point. The point is power. The point is really to effect power. I interviewed some weeks ago Raphaël Arnaud. He's with the La Jeune Garde in Lyon, so an anti-fascist collective in Lyon. For those who don't know, Lyon is basically the birthplace of Génération Identitaire and the identitarian generation. Identitarian is a nicer way of saying fascist, in my opinion. Génération Identitaire was banned some weeks ago, but they're still active in cities like Lyon. I will just link to that episode because he summarized things very well. One thing that it made me think of while we were talking, the reason why I wanted to bring it up, other than just recommending people listening to it, it's a short one, it's like 10 minutes long, is that there are elections coming up next year. And Le Pen's driving political energy is nationalism. She herself says it's about nationalism versus globalism. Anyone studying anti-Semitism knows the connotation of the term globalism. It actually literally started on far-right websites and far-right literature. It has a very, very old history because the idea of a globalist as attached to a Jewish person pre-Holocaust, but also post-Holocaust, is that that Jewish person cannot be a nationalist, cannot be French, cannot be Polish, cannot be, etc., etc. The Dreyfus affair was one of the founding stories of Herzl, and that's why Zionism came about. At least that's what he went into, because for him, and I'm almost paraphrasing him here, and I'm not supporting him whatsoever, but that's a paraphrase. It's just a historical fact that even in the land of enlightenment, they rejected us, and so therefore we cannot stay here. That was his argument. And so this goes back, the notion of a globalist, of someone who is not able, who does not have loyalty to the homeland, because that's where it comes from, has deep, deep, deep anti-Semitic roots and connotations. Now, it doesn't have to manifest itself against Jewish persons on a daily basis. It doesn't have to. In America, you had, Jared Kushner, who's Jewish, and Netanyahu, who's Jewish, supporting the Trump administration. I mean, it doesn't matter that much and on a day-to-day basis, but that's the underlying authoritarian logic that gets replicated. And what it does, and this is why I kind of transition to our conversation, what it does, especially, I mean, other than it being bad in itself and leading many Jewish persons who understand those coded languages, because it's not very coded if you're familiar with your own history as a Jewish person, the fear that this would generate, and etc., like this being bad in itself. But it also says something about society, that we those in power, are imposing a certain vision on society, and we who have the mechanisms of the state have the means to at least implement, to effect it on these bodies, in this case Muslims especially, but also possibly Jews. I mean, I really think that they are, if this continues, if Le Pen gets in power, I don't think they will be safe either. Unfortunately, many are led to believe that they would be by scapegoating Muslims, but that's not how things work, unfortunately, for everyone. So my question to you is maybe more of a, personal question, if that's okay. How concerned are you about the fact that there is a multicultural reality, regardless of what people who hate it want to believe? The fact that it exists means that they're going to do all kind of cards on the table that will be available to them depending on how much power they get and how much that tendency gets normalized by the time of the elections and after the election. But just like, how worried are you personally, maybe not personally, maybe just people maybe friends, maybe networks, maybe connections? Because I'm of Arab origins. I'm not Muslims, but most Islamophobes don't know the difference anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And I live in Geneva, which is close to France, has different tendencies for sure, but it's not that far away for me. It's literally surrounded by France. And so I'm seeing it from without in some ways, but also from within. I have family in Paris and in Marseille. And these are concerns of mine, both personally, but also just generally, because if this takes over France, it has connotations for the world in the same way as what we saw in the UK and in US. And personally, I think that it may have bigger consequences on the world if it takes over France, just due to the role of France within the EU. But that's a different debate. So just, yeah, how worried are you, or like how much are you comfortable sharing? You don't have to share everything.
No, of course. I will add before answering that also anti-Muslim bigotry is a business too. It makes money, quite literally. Actually, I would recommend, if I may, to read a report written by Wajahat Ali. He's an American author and analyst, and called Fear Inc. And he analyzes actually the phenomenon of Islamophobia and basically from where the money comes from and how, the machinery behind it. And this report is absolutely brilliant. I think it was done with the New America Institute. And I highly recommend it because you can see that in France too. Anti-Muslim bigotry makes the buzz. It makes money. Who cares about the truth? Like, just throw like a horrific thing. It will create an audience, which means it will get ads. And I mean, so yeah, I just wanted to throw that. As for multiculturalism, values, etc., it's very interesting, and I will get to the feelings after. In the end, vulnerable peoples or minorities, and in that case Muslim, are just asking to be treated as equal with their fellow Frenchmen and women. They are actually requiring laicité to apply to them, as in the state doesn't interfere with religious affairs and vice versa. They just want to be free. It's not too much for asking. I'm not saying everybody's perfect, that Muslims communities here have issues. I'm not saying that. And I think every community have issues. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that everything is perfect, but who is essentializing these communities? We keep saying we don't see race and multi-culturalism, boo-hoo. But who is talking about the Muslims, the Arabs, the immigrants who are not only at the same time stealing our jobs, but also living on state welfare? It's like, in that case, I'm sorry, like immigrants have skills. That's the Farad narrative. They steal our jobs, they steal our wives.
Can I
that's
just
so good.
interrupt you
Yeah,
and
sure.
mention there is such a thing called Schrodinger's immigrant. I don't know if you know it.
Oh, it speaks. Yeah, I think I go
like,
ahead. Yeah, it's
immigrants are both very lazy and they're also taking everyone's jobs. It's a magic. It's amazing.
They all should be hired.
Yeah, I think they should.
If you're lazy but still capable of accomplishing all of that, hey, like you're the CEO right now. Just to say, who is essentializing this population? We keep saying we don't see race, but the Muslims. Or like if something happened, like if there is a murder or an attack and an assault, this person originally from, I don't know, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, whatever. Yeah, he's French, but no, we are going to give the country, this sort of profiling. So in the end, who is like using categories while we are supposed to be a universalist country with universal values that don't see race or ethnicity or religion? The state is not doing the job. And I think that those who actually feel incredibly insecure are those in power. Again, those who have, because they know that, the balance is not in their favor. Like I said, they still consider these people are incapable of integrating. And as for my read, I'm terrified because I didn't mention it previously. I'm not an activist. I'm not doing like, I respect activists that are doing an incredible job. I'm the boring one, just analyzing policies and the law and trying to explain things, right? But I know the law and I know what it is capable of. It can do great things, but it also can do the worst. It's a bit like, having some sort of magic powers. You can do good, like if I'm using like some fantasy like comparison, but like you can do extremely good and you can do extremely bad things. And we have seen in the past how the law or even the constitution can commit the worst. I mean, if you look at the Holocaust, the way we treated Jews, it was legal. I mean, it was in the law, right? We were talking about the Vichy regime. Yes, it was the French state who, like lawmakers, passed laws, right? So just because it's legal doesn't mean it's morally acceptable, because it's not, of course. And unfortunately, I see that those who know how to use these tools, if not controlled, if not called out, if not pressured, will try to find ways to go after you because of who you are, and to make you, public enemy number one, just because, you are of North African background, Muslims, etc. Now, I also want to be hopeful because we also have, I'm not saying it's perfect because definitely it's not, but the judiciary as well is trying to do its job. But when you have lawmakers who pass crazy laws, the judiciary also have to interpret them in a way that also is respectful toward the law. But I mean, maybe that's the difference with, like the 30s or the 40s, is like today we do have mechanism of protection of human rights, like whether it's our different courts, like on the supreme level, even though, to be honest, like, okay, I'm not giving names, but some are really not doing their jobs. But we also have, for example, the European Court of Human Rights. And, so there are mechanisms. And today we also have international organization to protect human rights. But unfortunately, we see that it's all about pressure and diplomacy. I mean, in other parts of the world where genocides are being committed. I mean, look at what happened in China, for example, with the Uyghurs, or in Myanmar with the Rohingya, right? You call out and nothing happens. And actually that worries me because, just because we are I hate that word, but advanced democracy doesn't mean it can happen to us. And that's the problem, I think, in this country. And I think it's not just France, really. It's across democracies in general. We take liberties for granted. And we do not understand that it's an ongoing fight to protect and preserve them. And unfortunately, usually those who realize that are those who will be affected most if those liberties, civil liberties, were attacked, naming minorities, whether it's like the Muslims or the Jews or women or LGBTQ plus people, all the groups that are vulnerable because of their, of who they are. So yes, I'm extremely concerned. And actually what concerns me even more is those who can have a voice and yet remain silent. And I think that those who remain silent are even more guilty if something happens. I understand that sometimes it's very hard. I'm not saying go in the street and go before, whatever. But if you have the power to do something, at least use it behind the scenes. Try to do something. And some are just silent because, it's none of my concern. Or I don't want to get in and have problems, and from across, all fields, like even in academia, it's like you write about it in your like legal journal that nobody will read really. And you but you still refuse to, and I'm not saying that everyone do it, because some are doing it. Okay, I don't want to make a generality. There are extraordinary people here who are taking risks, who are being harassed on social media just because they dare to speak out. But those who remain silent, I hope they will be able to look at themselves in the mirror if things get worse and out of control.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's part of why I'm also worried. You never need a majority to do horrible things. You never need 50+% of the population. That has almost never happened. You almost never have more than 50% of the population anyway. Without being too generalizing either, there are different scenarios and different cases. The reason why I'm so worried about France, as I said, other than the personal link, is just I'm worried about how a lot of it is kind of happening below the surface, just because the Anglo world is not covering it well enough, because for the most part they just don't cover France very well, and vice versa, I should say. But yeah, I mean that's part of this conversation. It's part of the conversation I'll have with Daniel on anti-Semitism and on the left in the UK. It's authoritarianism, the conversation I had with Ida on the legacy of Bosnia. It wasn't just about Bosnia, it was the legacy of that situation legally as well. She's a scholar. So that's sort of like, I will wrap it up in some way. I will kind of try and have a positive-ish notes towards the end, so I don't depress everyone listening to me. But one thing I will say is that, I mean, you mentioned it yourself, institutions are better than they were back then. So I don't want people to just freak out and immediately go on a panic mode and just try and find a way out. I will say that the notion that it cannot happen here is a false one. It's a wrong one. It may not happen in the exact same way. The it may be defined differently, but something can happen here, and that something is what needs to be opposed. And it can't happen here is it's a novel by Sinclair, and I think he imagined like how a dictator would be in America, at the time of Hitler. It could happen here is a podcast by Robert Evans that I will recommend, in which he basically went through scenarios. That was in 2018, I think he released it, of how authoritarianism can come to America, culminating in the way he spoke about the rise of militias and potentially a coup on the Capitol, which is what we saw earlier this year. So a lot of people have been seeing the signs for a long time, and I think this benefits the fight, let's put it very broadly, or the struggle against authoritarianism broadly. There's quite a lot of groups. If not now is a group that comes up, an American Jewish group that basically, if not now, when? If not me, who? Like that's the quote. So that's where I will end it. I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I never do, or there's kind of no point doing this. But it is a concern. It's a real one. And with that, if that's okay, I don't know if you have 3 books to recommend.
Sure. If I may just chime in, like on a positive note as well, if yes, that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, I think that what is currently going on in France is that, and I often say that, France cannot keep its dirty laundry at home anymore. Because, for years it was, France, it's like the Eiffel Tower and macaron and croissant and whatever. Because we didn't have access as well to the media, and social media were not really a thing even 15 years ago, 10 years ago. I mean, it was not mainstreamed as it is right now. And today, I think that, I'm not saying it's easy, don't get me wrong, but stories are getting out of the borders. People are calling out, and compare it again, to 10 years ago, as recent as 10 years ago, you wouldn't have any coverage of these issues in, for example, the Anglo-American press. I'm taking the Anglo-American press because that's the one I know better, right? But because there was a barrier of the language, etc. But today, the population learn languages and are capable of sharing their stories, their experience. And France is shamed. And if there is something that us French are very productive about, It's our image. We have that thing like a rayonnement de la France à l'étranger, which is very pompous and arrogant, but that's the thing. I don't even know how to translate that, but the shining, like
the shining of France,
the shining across the world. Yeah. How basically, you know, we are the nation, the bastion of human rights, the Enlightenment, etc. And yet here we are. And the problem is, yeah, it's a beautiful country with a lot of potential, but we are basically ruining it. And France hates that. French authorities hate the fact that those stories are out there because they do not control the narrative anymore. And it is shameful for a country that prides itself in being the country of human rights, quote unquote. So again, the very fact that stories are being shared is also a huge positive element to, you know, to try to make things better. I mean, look, you have the New York Times now who translate their articles in French. It's not like, it is done in purpose, I think, right? So yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add that when there is a will, there is a way. And I truly believe and hope that at some point things will get better if we keep fighting for civil liberties. But because again, it goes beyond Muslims. It's everybody at some point as humans, as citizens, who are going to be affected if nothing is done about it. Sorry for that.
No, not at all. Thanks a lot for that. I think it's a good note. I mean, I think it's a good way of ending the official conversation, official episode. But before doing that, if we can enter, do you have 3 books to recommend that we can kind of talk about? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, sure. I would try not to give away too much either, if you don't mind. So the first book for all of you nerds is a book from, I take some notes just to be sure that I have all elements from Canadian political scientist, Nader Hashmi. And the name, I don't know if you know about him.
Sorry, I'm laughing because I just interviewed him 2 weeks ago.
He's amazing, isn't he?
Yeah. He's gonna be, the episode will be out by the time our episode is out.
Oh, that's awesome. There you go. I didn't do it on purpose. Like, see, like the stars aligned. So his book, Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy Towards a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies. It's from 2009 at Oxford University Press. Essentially, his book is very complex, but so accessible as well. It's really well written with a lot of different, it's a comparative study as well. And he kind of challenges the question, again, from a comparative perspective, and also with a lot of historical elements about the process of the tensions between Islam and liberal democracies, and challenge these widely beliefs, these kind of stereotypes, really, that argue that, and I think it's connected to what we have been discussed, right? The so-called incompatibility of religion with liberal democracy. And it's very interesting because he takes he goes through a lot of studies, especially France, who else? Turkey as well, Indonesia. I mean, it's really fascinating, and it gives you like sneak peeks at how he processed to bring some sort of fresh ideas, a fresh analysis on the issue. And it's very timely. It's from 2009, but I think it's still very, very timely. So it's academic, right? It's not a novel or whatsoever, but sometimes you need, like, nerds are very needed too. Like, I think, I'm among those. So that would be my first recommendation. My second one, is that okay if it's in French? I'm sorry, like...
Yes, there's no rule on that. I'm just making it up as I go along, so go for it.
Oh, awesome. Excellent. So my second is a book from Nisreen Slawi. She is a journalist called Illegitimate. And she basically narrates her path and her struggles coming from an immigrant family. She's French of Moroccan background. Her family, so she like her family is like you know, from the working class, and you know, navigate. She tried to narrate how she navigates through you know, those origins, this background, and she managed to get into Sciences Po, which is one of the most elitist school of higher education in the country. I think everybody knows what Sciences Po is. Yeah, that's basically her journey and how tough this journey is, and how she became a journalist after, I mean, she studied journalism there, and how even after studying at Sciences Po, you know, she's still like struggling with that, and how she's perceived even in the milieu, right, in her field of work. So it's beautiful, and really highly recommended. I don't want to give away too much, but it's like the idea came from, like, I mean, she published like some interview she had with her grandpa who cannot speak French, and it's beautiful. So I think it speaks volume about, you know, the current situation in France, about social mobility, how in the end the elitist schools as well are still reserved for the elite, and how it is hard for the minorities to get into them. Even if they get into them, they will be accused of, you know, benefiting from what we call, I hate that term, positive discrimination programs, which I won't even compare with the American one, because I think it's a false and terrible comparison. And how in the end, it's like, if I cannot access the elite, how do you want the system to change as well? And at the time when Emmanuel Macron announced that he wanted to end the École Nationale d'Administration, the ENA, to tackle those issues, I'm like, what good it does to basically, you know, remove an institution, and then what? Like, the issues have to be tackled, I think, at the roots, starting in, you know, with housing and social issues, and you know, yeah, racism, discrimination, the situation in the banlieue, you know, the poorest neighborhood in the country. And yeah, anyway, highly recommended. And the third one is a beautiful and very powerful book by Rachid Zerouki, 2020 at Robert Laffont, called Les Incasables. I don't know how to translate that, but meaning the people we cannot put into a box, like place in an environment because they do not fit. Yeah, those who cannot fit, the unfitted. I don't know, it's a neologism, but you know. And Rashid basically tells his journey as a teacher in a public school, but he teaches specifically in what we call the SEGPA, so the sections of adapted general education professional training. And usually these are kids who are in great difficulties, whether it's because of health issues or social issues, economic issues, and they're like, even within their families, sometimes they are like in foster families. I mean, life has not been kind to them. And I know, even when I used to go to school, the SECPA were considered as the people you should not deal with or be involved with or be friends with. One of my closest friends was in a SECPA, right? And he's still a friend of mine, you know, and yeah, they are marginalized. And he's telling his story as a teacher in such an environment, and all the lessons of life he learned thanks to these kids. And he starts with his own origins. So he's French Moroccan. So he was born in Morocco and lived there until he came to France. I don't want to give away too much, but it's an homage to public school. It's an homage to public education, public schools that are today being insulted, disregarded. Like, we treat public school like things that are worthless. I mean, just how we teach teachers during COVID, right? I mean, it's horrific, and I really highly recommend it. And I hope these two books, who are written in French, will at some point be translated, because they really are great. So, yeah.
Well, amazing. Reem Sarah, thanks a lot for your time. This has really been amazing.
Yeah, I hope it was useful. I hope I made. I'm sorry, English is not my first language, so sometimes it might be a bit.
You were more than fine. Everything was
okay.
fine.
Seriously, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
The Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.